November 11th, 1940. Toledo, Ohio. A squat, square machine, barely 4 feet tall, rolls out of a garage and into history. It weighs just 2,450 pounds, carries a 60-horsepower Go Devil engine, and somehow will survive North African sand at 120 degrees, Pacific jungle mud, and Normandy bomb craters where trucks and tanks sank to their axles. By 1945, over 660,000 of them will cross every front line on Earth. Mechanics will rebuild them under shell fire in 27 minutes flat. Engineers will shave steel, alter gearing, and redesign its cooling just to make it breathe through dust storms and crawl out of craters steeper than 60 degrees. This is how American engineers created a vehicle that ignored terrain, outthought physics, and changed how armies moved forever. Stay with me, because the secret wasn't strength. It was design logic, measured in inches, ratios, and torque. The U.S. Army's Quartermaster Corps had given engineers an impossible math problem. A vehicle under 2,200 pounds, capable of four-wheel drive, hauling 600 pounds of men and gear, and doing 50 miles per hour on the road, yet still climbing out of a 60% grade of mud. Only one company believed it could be done: Willys-Overland, a mid-tier automaker nearly bankrupt before the war. Chief engineer Delmar "Barney" Roos built his answer around a single principle: torque over glamour. His 2.2-liter Go Devil engine produced 105 foot-pounds of torque, 25% more than Ford's prototype, and nearly 30% more than Bantam's. That torque fed into 5.38-to-1 differential gearing, so each wheel multiplied the pull fivefold. In testing, the Jeep dragged 3 tons across a plowed field without stalling, something no motorcycle or light truck could match. The result stunned the Ordnance Department. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. A Jeep could crawl at 2 miles an hour without slipping, then surge to 55 on pavement the next moment. Its 80-inch wheelbase and 48-inch track width formed a near-perfect square, letting each tire follow the path of the one ahead. In mud or sand, that geometry meant survival. 4 cuts in the ground, not 8 trenches. Records from Aberdeen Proving Ground note it bluntly. Vehicle maintained traction where all others failed. Soldiers would soon discover it could climb bomb craters, cross shell-churned terrain, and still start after a night buried in dust. But desert heat would expose its first flaw: engines cooking in their own armor of sand. January 1942, Egypt. Mechanics watched radiators boil over in the noon sun. The Jeep could conquer terrain, but not temperature. To survive North Africa, engineers would have to make it breathe through a storm. By early 1942, the U.S. had shipped its first 15,000 Jeeps to the British 8th Army in North Africa. Within weeks, reports poured back from Egypt and Libya: overheating, clogged filters, engines dying halfway through the march to Tobruk. In desert temperatures topping 125 degrees, the Jeep's tight grille and small radiator simply couldn't breathe. Sand caked the fins, dust strangled the carburetor. At first, the solution was crude. Mechanics at Alexandria dockyards took hacksaws to the Jeep's 7-slot grille, slicing out every other bar. The change cut airflow resistance by 38% and dropped coolant temperatures by nearly 20 degrees Fahrenheit under load. Then came the condensing can modification, a hand-built desert kit that rerouted engine heat away from the oil bath filter and fitted a secondary condenser above the fan. It turned the Go Devil engine into a sand-resistant lung. Field data from the Long Range Desert Group, the British unit that operated hundreds of Jeeps behind enemy lines, showed the transformation. Before modification, an average Jeep needed water every 40 miles. After redesign, they ran 110 miles between refills, across terrain hot enough to melt tire compound. Willys engineers back home studied those numbers like battlefield intelligence. They widened the front grille officially, added a 12-blade cooling fan, and replaced smooth road tires with combat pattern cross grips that doubled traction in loose sand. Every design change came from men who'd nearly died trying to keep the original alive. One of them, Staff Sergeant Bill Owens of the LRDG, wrote in his log, "We drove through sand that swallowed tanks. The Jeeps just floated." That float came from 6.0 AX16 tires, inflated to just 15 psi, spreading the 2,400-pound load so evenly that the Jeep's footprint matched a man's boot. By summer 1943, the desert had become the Jeep's proving ground, an engineering crucible that forged its legend. But victory in sand opened a new nightmare: mud. In Italy and Burma, monsoon rains turned supply roads into rivers. The same geometry that saved the Jeep in sand now worked against it. October 1943. Salerno front. Rain for 5 straight days. Engines drowning in clay, wheels spinning uselessly. The solution would come not from engineers, but from soldiers with shovels, rope, and a field modification that changed off-road warfare forever. Autumn 1943. Italy's roads dissolved into mud. Tanks bogged to their turrets. Trucks sank to the axles. And yet the war still demanded movement. Fuel, wounded, ammunition. The Jeep was light enough to ride where roads ended, but not immune. Wet clay built up inside its shallow treads until the wheels turned into slick drums. Infantrymen improvised. At Salerno, engineers of the 36th Infantry Division bolted spare barbed wire coils around rear tires to claw through mud. It worked. Torque loss dropped by 40%. Traction nearly doubled. Willys engineers took note. Within 6 weeks, factory Jeeps left assembly lines fitted for anti-skid chains and deep-lug mud and snow tires, each tread block spaced to clear clay every half rotation. But traction wasn't the only problem. The mud swallowed engines. Jeep carburetors sat just 18 inches off the ground. A single flooded ditch could drown them. Field mechanics began rigging up makeshift snorkels from steel tubing, raising the intake above the hood. Willys copied the idea. The next model raised its air intake by 7 inches and sealed the distributor cap, turning the Jeep into a miniature amphibian. Data from the 5th Army's engineering section in January 1944 recorded it. Vehicle capable of continuous operation in 30-inch water depth for 1 hour without stall. For context, that meant crossing a shell crater the size of a living room, full of rainwater and shrapnel, and driving out the other side without stalling. Even the clutch got a redesign. Early models failed when caked in silt. New ones used cotton fiber facings that gripped through moisture and grit. Each mechanical failure in Italy became a blueprint for the Pacific, where mud wasn't seasonal, it was permanent. In Burma, Merrill's marauders used Jeeps to drag artillery through jungle rivers, attaching rope lashings and bamboo poles to distribute load. A single Jeep could tow a 37mm gun through muck that stopped mules. It was crude, dangerous, but it worked. And then, from those hacks, came revelation. By 1944, Willys began producing factory winches, fording kits, and interchangeable tire sets based entirely on what soldiers had invented in the field. It was the first modular battlefield vehicle in history. Each innovation bled from necessity, written in mud. But another front was waiting. One that would test the Jeep's balance, its suspension, and its sheer ability to stay upright under fire. June 1944. Normandy. The sand here wasn't soft. It was shrapnel, steel, and cratered clay. The Jeep had survived heat and swamp, but on D-Day it would face the ultimate terrain, a beach built by bombs. June 6, 1944. Normandy. At 06:45 hours, the first jeeps rolled off Higgins boats onto Omaha and Utah beaches, their wheels sinking into churned sand still hot from bombardment. The Army had landed over 36,000 vehicles that day. Only one type drove off without needing a tow: the Jeep. What saved it was geometry again. Each wheel sat on a semi-elliptical leaf spring suspension, 8 leaves stacked like armor plates. The setup wasn't elegant, but it absorbed impacts that shattered truck axles. Tests at ordnance depots showed a Jeep could drop from a 4-foot ledge, equivalent to the lip of a bomb crater, and keep running. No other vehicle in its weight class survived that fall. Ground clearance stood at 8.5 inches, enough to straddle steel fragments and shell holes without grounding. The frame, welded from 5 cross members, flexed just enough to absorb blast shock, but not enough to crack the drivetrain. In mud, the Jeep rode like a mule. In craters, it bounced like rubber. Soldiers joked it had no right to survive the laws of physics. But it did, again and again. Mechanics at Omaha logged one of the war's strangest field records: a Jeep hit by 12 fragments of 88mm shell. With 2 tires shredded and the radiator punctured, still drove 3.2 miles back to the aid post on rim and axle alone. The Go Devil engine, bleeding coolant, refused to die. Its cast-iron block, weighing 358 pounds, was so overbuilt that armorers said it could take a bullet and shrug. In aerial photos taken that week, you can trace the Jeep's route: little curved tracks winding between craters where nothing else moved. General Eisenhower would later call it one of the 3 machines that won the war, beside the M1 Garand and the C-47 Skytrain. He wasn't exaggerating. Without the Jeep, the bridgehead would have stalled within hours. Medics couldn't have reached the wounded. Radio operators couldn't have hauled sets, and ammunition couldn't have crossed soft sand fast enough to feed the guns. But even as the beaches stabilized, another problem emerged: too many wounded, too few ambulances. By dusk on D-Day, Jeep drivers were lashing stretchers across their hoods and fenders, improvising the first frontline ambulance fleet in history. The results shocked medical officers. Survival rates for the wounded doubled within days. That improvisation would ignite a new transformation. Within months, factory engineers back home would design the first Jeep ambulance kits, turning the same machine that climbed bomb craters into one that pulled men out of them. And in the Pacific, that idea would go even further, because there, mud and sand weren't enemies. They were the battlefield itself. August 1943, Guadalcanal. Rain fell in sheets, 6 inches a day. What wasn't mud was jungle. What wasn't jungle was swamp. Trucks rusted in place. Horses drowned in the muck. But the Jeeps, those squat steel animals that had survived Africa and Normandy, refused to die. They choked. They sank. But they clawed out again. It was here that American engineers realized they weren't building vehicles anymore. They were building amphibians. Reports from the 1st Marine Division arrived in Washington. Jeeps were hauling wounded through rivers, engines submerged up to the headlights, transmissions underwater for minutes at a time. So Ford engineers went back to the drawing board. The result, the GPA, nicknamed Seep, Sea Jeep. Built from 1942 through 1943, Ford produced 12,178 of them. Each weighed 3,500 pounds, stretched to 15 feet, and carried a sealed steel hull shaped like a bathtub. Propulsion came from a rear-mounted 2-bladed propeller driven off the transmission, giving the Seep a top speed of 5.5 knots in water and 50 miles per hour on land. But its real marvel lay beneath the waterline. Engineers sealed every gasket, rerouted the exhaust through a vertical snorkel, and raised the ignition to shoulder height. A Seep could enter the water at a 45-degree angle, float on its own displacement, and drive straight up a riverbank as if climbing a ramp. In testing off the coast of Florida, Ford's prototype crossed 7 miles of open water without failure. In the Pacific, they ferried Marines across flooded causeways, carried ammo to beachheads, and evacuated the wounded under fire. Not every experiment worked. The GPA was too heavy for surf landings. Waves above 3 feet could swamp it. Still, its design data created a ripple effect through every Willys MB built afterward. Tighter seals, higher venting, raised distributor caps, improved fuel waterproofing. By 1944, standard Jeeps could ford 30 inches of water and operate in conditions that destroyed most tracked vehicles. In Burma, U.S. and Chinese troops used them to tow 75mm pack howitzers up slopes slick as glass. On Bougainville, medics turned them into floating triage units, fitting canvas pontoons and bamboo outriggers to haul stretchers across flooded jungle streams. In all, over 50,000 modified amphibious Jeeps served in the Pacific campaigns, some official, most improvised. Their role wasn't speed, it was continuity. Wherever men could not walk, a Jeep would find a way to crawl, float, or grind forward. Lieutenant Harold Agerholm proved it at Saipan in July 1944. Driving an ambulance Jeep, he pulled 45 wounded Marines from the front lines under sniper fire before being killed himself. He received the Medal of Honor, posthumously. The Jeep he drove survived, riddled with holes, its engine still running when they found him. The Pacific forced the final evolution, from vehicle to system. One platform, dozens of lives saved, hundreds of roles served. But one question remained. How could a 60-horsepower machine carry an entire war? Stay with me, because next we'll see how American logistics, torque, transport, and tonnage turned a 2,400-pound Jeep into the mathematical weapon that outmoved the Axis. The war was won not only by weapons, but by numbers, and none told a clearer story than the Jeep. By late 1944, Willys-Overland and Ford together had produced 660,703 of them. That's one Jeep for every 50 American soldiers deployed overseas. A single assembly line in Toledo turned out one Jeep every 80 seconds, 24 hours a day. Each required 340 feet of wiring, 120 pounds of steel plate, and 5 gallons of paint. The Go Devil engine alone contained 134 precision parts, machined to tolerances as fine as 1,000th of an inch. The cost? Just $738 per vehicle, less than the price of a single Army mule in 1939. But the miracle wasn't how they were built. It was how they moved. From Michigan to the front lines, a Jeep's life followed a logistical rhythm America alone could sustain. Rail to port, crate to convoy, ship to shore. In 1944, 7,500 Jeeps crossed the Atlantic every month, enough steel and rubber to fill the decks of 10 Liberty ships. Those Liberty ships themselves were part of the same industrial DNA. Each could carry over 200 Jeeps lashed in rows below decks. One ship, the SS Robert E. Peary, was built in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes, faster than it took a German submarine to complete a single patrol. In Europe, logistics officers measured mobility in Jeeps per division. A typical U.S. infantry division deployed with 145 Jeeps, a tank division with 675, a number equal to its medium tanks. They were the nervous system of an army on the move. Radio Jeeps, command Jeeps, medevac Jeeps, reconnaissance Jeeps, even para-Jeeps, dropped by glider behind enemy lines. Every soldier knew its math. One Jeep carried 4 men, 600 pounds of gear, and 11 gallons of fuel. 4 Jeeps could move an entire infantry platoon faster than any truck could reach them. Fuel efficiency was brutal, just 15 miles per gallon. But logistics made up the difference. By the end of 1944, Allied pipelines in France were pumping over 1 million gallons of gasoline a day. enough to keep 40,000 jeeps moving non-stop from Normandy to the Rhine. The result was a kind of mechanical swarm. Tiny, unarmored, unthreatening, but everywhere. Eisenhower called it one of the three tools that won the war. Soviet soldiers called it the Amerika Tankette. German troops had another name. Das kriechende Tier, the crawling animal. Because wherever it appeared, the front line moved. But what the soldiers didn't know was that the Jeep's power wasn't in its engine or its steel. It was in its modular brain, its ability to become anything. Gun truck, radio van, snow tractor, even railroad locomotive. And that's where we go next. Winter 1944. Ardennes forest. Temperatures drop below zero. Supply lines freeze solid. Somehow the Jeep keeps moving, on skis. December 18, 1944, Ardennes forest. Snow 3 feet deep. Temperature 10 degrees. The U.S. Army's supply columns had frozen solid. Engines refused to turn over. Diesel gelled. Trucks were immobile hulks buried under ice. Yet at dawn, a low growl echoed through the pines. Jeep engines, coughing, sputtering, then roaring to life. At Bastogne, mechanics discovered that the Go Devil engine's low compression ratio, 6.5 to 1, made it easier to start than any other motor in the field. A quick hand crank and a splash of gasoline into the carburetor throat could wake it even in Arctic cold. The Army dubbed it the vehicle that never sleeps. But traction was a different battle. Tires hardened like rock, spinning uselessly on ice. So soldiers improvised again. In one of the war's strangest field experiments, the 10th Mountain Division lashed discarded aircraft landing wire around the tires for grip. Willys engineers heard about it within weeks and began shipping official Ardennes kits, steel stud chains with a built-in tightening cam. With them, the Jeep could climb a 40-degree icy slope and tow an anti-tank gun up a snowbank. Then came the next innovation: skis. In the Vosges and Italian Alps, mechanics replaced front wheels with 36-inch wooden skis, bolting them directly to the hubs, while rear tires stayed chained for drive. A Jeep so modified could pull a 500-pound sledge through drifts that swallowed half-tracks. Test reports from the 99th Infantry Division listed average speeds of 8 miles per hour in 24-inch snow, enough to deliver food and ammunition when nothing else moved. Even the fuel system evolved. In freezing air, carburetors iced and starved engines of oxygen. The fix was counterintuitive. Soldiers wrapped exhaust tubing around the intake manifold to warm it. Field. Engineering so effective it became a post-war production standard. The Jeep's electrical system, 6 volts instead of 12, was primitive but rugged. It powered dim lights, not bright ones, which made it invisible to German night patrols. Soldiers learned to drive by shadow and sound. In the Battle of the Bulge, forward observers called it the heartbeat in the dark. Through those 6 weeks of ice and fire, Jeeps ran non-stop. They carried ammo when horses froze, wounded when ambulances couldn't move, and generals when radios went silent. Statistics from the Third Army after the battle listed over 22,000 Jeeps operational across the front, more than half the vehicles in Patton's force. But winter did something else. It proved the Jeep's identity wasn't mechanical anymore. It was psychological. When soldiers heard that cough of the Go Devil in the dark, they knew help was coming. And as the snow thawed in March 1945, that sound moved east, with the armies crossing the Rhine into the heart of Germany itself. March 23, 1945. Wesel, Germany. The Rhine, the last natural wall between the Allies and the German heartland, was a mile wide, its bridges all demolished. Tanks couldn't cross. Trucks waited on the western bank. But before dawn, shapes began to move in the mist. Lines of Jeeps, canvas-covered, engines muffled, rolling onto pontoon ferries. Within 36 hours, Over 1,100 jeeps had crossed with the first wave of engineers and infantry. They became command posts on wheels. Radios crackled from dashboards, maps were pinned to windshields, antennas swayed like spears. The 83rd Infantry Division reported using 54 radio-equipped jeeps to control artillery fire across a front of 20 miles, a task that would have required a headquarters train in 1918. Once ashore, the jeeps scattered through the ruins of the Reich like mercury. They towed artillery across blown bridges using portable Bailey panels, ferried ammunition into fire zones where nothing tracked could fit, and even ran on captured fuel filtered through torn shirts and coffee filters. When the 2nd Armored Division raced toward the Elbe, the jeep's 60-horsepower Hart carried entire regimental staffs over mine-pitted roads at 40 miles/hour, speed enough to outrun their own artillery fire. German prisoners later wrote of their disbelief. "These little cars were everywhere," one officer recalled. "They came before the shells, before the tanks, before the end." By April 1945, the U.S. Army listed over 650,000 jeeps in active service worldwide. That number meant mobility on a scale no army had ever achieved. Every 4 soldiers in Europe shared one jeep. In some Pacific units, the ratio was 1:2. It was the literal engine of Allied coordination. Front to rear, land to sea, factory to foxhole. And then came the quiet transformation. As the war wound down, engineers began testing what peace might look like on 4 wheels. They stripped the rifle mounts, added tailgates, replaced olive drab with harvest green. The result rolled out in July 1945, the CJ-2A, civilian Jeep. It kept the same Go Devil engine, the same 80-inch wheelbase, the same ability to climb a 60% grade, but it now plowed fields instead of beaches. From battlefield to barnyard, the lineage was unbroken. Every off-road vehicle since, the Land Rover, the Bronco, the modern SUV, carries the ghost geometry of that 1940 Willys. Short wheelbase, low gearing, flat torque curve. But in April 1945, before peace arrived, one more mission remained. Berlin was burning, roads were rubble, and the first Allied vehicle to enter the city wasn't a tank. It was a Jeep. Stay with me, because that final drive into the ruins will show why engineers called it indestructible and why soldiers called it home. April 26, 1945. Berlin was a skeleton. Streets cratered, bridges gone, the smell of smoke and brick dust thick as fog. Soviet armor approached from the east, American convoys from the west. Between them, the world's most famous little machine kept moving. Slow, battered, but unstoppable. Staff Sergeant Joe Barrow, one of the first American soldiers to link up with the Red Army, described the moment simply, "We drove into Berlin in a Jeep. Nothing else could fit through the rubble." The road they followed wasn't a road anymore, just broken stones and twisted tram rails. Yet the Jeep's 80-inch wheelbase and independent leaf spring articulation let it crawl over wreckage like an insect over bones. It didn't need roads. It made them. Photographs from those final days show Jeeps with bullet holes, mismatched tires, even missing fenders, still running. One Army report from the 9th Armored Division lists a Jeep that completed 1,646 combat miles with 3 cracked pistons and a broken rear leaf spring, repaired 13 times in the field but never replaced. Mechanics joked it was the only soldier who didn't ask for rest. When the guns fell silent on May 8th, the numbers spoke louder than any speech. 660,703 Jeeps produced, 360,000 by Willys, 277,000 by Ford. They had served in every theater, on every continent, in temperatures from 40 degrees to 130 degrees, and on every surface man could fight on. Sand, snow, jungle, ice, rubble. General Eisenhower's final wartime. cable to Washington listed the Jeep alongside the POW, C-47, and the M1 Garand as tools that won the war. Soviet Marshal Zhukov called it the soldier's horse. British commandos called it the chariot. For the men who rode them, it was something else, a companion. Soldiers carved names into the dashboards: Lil Joe, Mud Hen, the Faithful One. They spoke of their Jeeps like comrades who bled and carried them home. After the war, tens of thousands of those same vehicles were sold to farmers, explorers, missionaries. They crossed continents in peace as they had in war. In the decades that followed, their descendants, CJ, Wrangler, Land Cruiser, Defender, would inherit the same principle written into steel in 1940. Simplicity equals survival. In total, the Jeep's war miles exceeded 3 billion, enough to circle the Earth 120,000 times. No other machine has ever connected so many fronts, nations, and lives through nothing but design and courage. When the last convoys left Berlin, a war correspondent watched one Jeep rumble out of the city, its paint scorched, windshield cracked, an American flag tied to the antenna. He wrote, "It didn't drive through victory. It drove through everything else," and kept going. The war was over. The Jeep's story wasn't. The war ended, but the Jeep never stopped moving. By 1946, thousands of demilitarized MBs rolled off ships back into civilian life. Farmers bought them for $50 apiece, stripped off rifle racks, and hitched plows to the back. In a single year, Willys sold over 214,000 CJ-22As, marketing them with a new slogan: "The sun never sets on the Jeep." It wasn't a metaphor. Former war machines were now hauling milk in Kansas, hauling timber in Burma, and crossing deserts in North Africa under the United Nations flag. The same Go Devil engine that had pulled wounded men from Saipan was now powering irrigation pumps in India. Engineers studying the design found something astonishing. The Jeep's center of gravity, just 21 inches off the ground, gave it the perfect balance between agility and stability. Its wheel track of 48 inches became the template for every light four-wheel drive vehicle built afterward. Land Rover used it. Toyota copied it. The Soviets cloned it as the Gaz-69. Even NASA's lunar roving vehicle, tested in 1969, borrowed its torque distribution model. The design logic that once conquered mud and bomb craters became the DNA of modern mobility. From Arctic expeditions to jungle rescues, from Dakar to Kabul, wherever there's no road, there's a descendant of that 1940s square-hooded prototype still grinding forward. Yet its influence wasn't just mechanical, it was philosophical. The Jeep proved that mobility could be as decisive as firepower. In the Cold War, NATO planners built entire doctrines, air-land battle, rapid reaction forces, around that principle. Light, flexible, fast. Every Humvee, every armored personnel carrier, every reconnaissance drone that followed carries that same invisible blueprint. Speed, simplicity, survivability. In museums today, Jeeps sit silent, paint faded, engines cold. But the numbers still hum underneath. 60 horsepower, 105 foot-pounds of torque, 2,400 pounds total weight, 66703 built. And somewhere, in the dust of an old airfield or the mud of a forgotten trail, one of them still starts on the first crank. 85 years later, it remains the most successful off-road vehicle ever made. Not because of what it destroyed, but because of what it connected. Mud, sand, bomb craters, three enemies of motion, defeated not by armor, but by understanding. American engineers didn't just build a vehicle. They built momentum itself. And that's how a four-cylinder engine on an 80-inch frame became the machine that could, quite literally, go anywhere. November 11th, 1940. A small, square machine rolled out of a Toledo garage, Just 2,400 pounds of steel and stubbornness. No armor, no luxury, no promise that it would survive. And yet, 5 years later, it had crossed deserts, mountains, rivers, and cities reduced to dust. It carried generals to victory and wounded men to safety. It climbed bomb craters deeper than itself and rolled through wars larger than imagination. It did one thing better than anything else mankind had built. It moved forward. Today, its descendants still do, on farms, in forests, in storms, and on screens. Everywhere movement still matters. Because the Jeep wasn't just a vehicle, it was proof that genius could be simple, and that courage could have 4 wheels. From Toledo to Tunis, from Saipan to Berlin. 80 years later, the sound of that little 4-cylinder still means one thing. The world is about to move again.